Today on the Mr. Maple podcast, Matt and Brian break down Japanese maple gardening for beginners.
Hey guys, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. We really appreciate you tuning into our podcast. You can find these on all major podcast platforms under the Mr. Maple Show and also on YouTube. We launch these on YouTube every Sunday at 8 p.m. and we'd love for you to be part of our live chat there. There's a great community of people that tune in, and hey, we appreciate you tuning in wherever you're at. So I'm Matt.
And I'm Brian, and I'm excited to be joining my brother from another mother today. We're always trying to think of some cool things. I mean, we could just sit around and talk plants for hours and hours. So we're like, well, why not just record it?
Right.
That's kind of what this podcast is all about, is just spending time with you guys and just talking about plants, man. I love it.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about, Japanese maples for beginners and giving you some tips to beginners. We have a lot of expert people here on our channel. We have a lot of people here at Mr. Maple who are quite plant experts as well. But today we're kind of breaking it down, going to some of the basics. We want to give, people that are new to Japanese maples a little bit more confidence in getting into them, and just some small tips, some small suggestions, and kind of a little guideline for getting into Japanese maples for beginners.
Well, the cool thing is that we all start out as beginners, right? I mean, you were a beginner at one point. I was. I mean, it's kind of a cool place to start. Because there's so much to explore and enjoy and discover. The world of Japanese maples is huge. Mm-hmm. And I don't think when you first get started, you don't really realize just what you're about to get yourself into, right?
That's one of my favorite things about Japanese maples. I mean, some people would say, oh, you're an expert. My field changes so quickly. Yeah. Like I've been the president of the North American Maple Society. I've been all around the world studying. Right. There's always something new. There's always something I'm learning from somebody. There's always something I don't know. And that's the way I always approach it. I try to come in with that level of humility. And there's always something new to be learned, especially with plants. You think you know everything. Mother Nature will teach you don't really quickly. You never say never with plants. But this one's kind of for people who are new to Japanese maples and they're getting into it for the first time. We've got some trees that tend to be gateway plants for people into Japanese maples. Full warning, you're going to get addicted. You can't have just one. It's like having one potato chip. You can't have one Japanese maple. They too tend to be plants that you start changing your whole plans for the whole yard around, right? Everything changes once you get that maple bug.
Well, and too, also, a lot of people think that you have to be some master gardener or some, amazing green thumb to be able to embark into the world of Japanese maples and to plant one in your garden. You really don't have to be those things. If you can follow some basics, and we're going to go over those basic tips today, you can very successfully grow Japanese maples in so many different climates and zones and gardens and soils. Right. I mean, it really is a lot simpler than you might think that it is.
They can be intimidating, especially for new gardeners. I know a lot of people think, well, I don't have a green thumb, and how can I do this? Especially getting into Japanese gardening. And there's kind of just different levels of plant collecting. A lot of people get in through something easy. Like you can leave a daylily on top of the soil for 4 years and not plant it in Minnesota, and the thing's probably going to live, right? Like there's some plants that are so easy that you can't kill them. And so people see that, and maybe they got in through something basic like that. And eventually you start to develop these different gardening tastes. And I think inevitably, the pinnacle of that, or at least it is for me, you start to get into Japanese maples and conifers as you kind of mature in your gardening level of expertise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely is a world that just really brings so much diversity and just so much to the landscape. I think that's what people are drawn to it for, is just all of the amazing colors and shapes and forms and textures. It's really exciting especially for that beginner, because I mean, you have this crazy world in front of you that you haven't yet discovered. And I just think back when I first got my first Japanese maple, a friend of mine gave it to me. as a housewarming gift, and I planted it out in my yard. And then I started thinking about, man, I really like that plant. Like I want to learn more about it. And so I just started doing research and learning more about Japanese maples. And before I knew it, I had quite a collection.
Right. Now, if you guys are new to Japanese maples and you're new to finding out about Mr. Maple, we have a YouTube channel where we put out 7 days a week content. So if we don't cover the specific topic you're dying to find out about here today, chances are we have a video on it on our YouTube channel. There are back catalogs of thousands of videos with all kinds of questions. People say, well, do you put out a care sheet on every single tree? And I'm like, we have a care sheet that's interactive with everything. So there's also a place for maple info on MrMaple.com, and you can always go scroll down there for beginner type tip things. We're going to go over some of that, but if we don't get into your specific question today, fret not. We've got it done, and you can go probably watch a demonstration on how to do it on our YouTube channel as well.
Absolutely. We have an extensive catalog of videos, like you're saying. We also have those kind of broke down in playlists here on our YouTube channel where you can kind of go to specific types of videos that we're doing. Usually our Fridays are kind of question answer. We talk about pruning. We talk about all different fertilizing, planting techniques, all those kind of things that if you want to really deep dive into all that, we have that material today available. But today we were kind of just saying, hey, let's talk to somebody who's really just first getting into it, and hopefully we can help you out. Yeah,
let's get into some basic tips. This sounds really simple, and it really is. I think most of the times the mistakes that beginners make are overdoing something. And it's true. I see it in a lot of Facebook groups about Japanese maples in a lot of places, but sometimes a little bit of knowledge can be a bad thing too, because we over apply the one thing we're familiar with. And so we'll overdo that one thing. Oftentimes what I advise people to do are plant your tree correctly, and then the least you do to it, the better. Right. So let nature do its thing. Let it get established. If you're not overwatering and over fertilizing and doing all those other things, you're going to have a healthier, happier plant. Now, there's always steps you have to take. I always let people know when they get into Japanese maples, people will say, well, I planted it and I don't know what went wrong. My tree doesn't look great this year. Well, they are kind of like a puppy. They do require some steps. Like, you don't think of it that way with plants, but you wouldn't not water your puppy. You wouldn't give your puppy no food and things it needs to succeed. And this is a living plant. So you want to remember with Japanese maples, there's steps in place to give yourself the best success.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think just to kind of expand on that, a lot of times as a beginner, you don't really know what to expect with your plant and how it develops. And so a lot of times that first year, you get the plant, it looks great, you put it out in your landscape, and then summer hits and it starts looking a little ragged and you're wondering, a lot of times, man, that is just part of the process. There's an acclimation to your garden, to your landscape that happens with almost all plants that you plant out there. And a lot of times it's just a cosmetic issue. It's not really anything to be too concerned about. Because I know that when we get emails all the time, right? My tree's dying and it's like a little burnt leaf on the side. And it's like, well, it's summer, some of that happens. And I think as a beginner, you're afraid because you're trying to take care of this new
little micromanage.
This new thing that, there's a leaf, it's changing. I don't know what's happening. But so, there is a lot of nerves and things like that involved when you're just getting started with your plant. But, at the end of the day, Japanese maples are pretty easy to grow.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are going to over micromanage their maple because it's the thing they paid more for in their garden. They might have skipped out on the hosta. They might have skipped out on something else, but they went big. And they went with something cool or interesting, or maybe even the smaller plant, but something they really cared about and were passionate about in the Japanese maple. And so they're more invested in that. And so a lot of times our nature is to over micromanage the thing that we really are excited about. So location is one of the first tips we'll get into. Now, basically location can vary a good bit. Now, Japanese maples are going to work zones 5 through 9. Yeah. There are some exceptions to that with Pseudosboldianum being able to go into colder zones. But in general, for most of you beginners, maples are going to work zones 5 through 9. And the easiest place to grow Japanese maples is the place none of us have in our gardens, but that's early morning sun with late day shade. That's going to normally give you your best colors. So if you have an open blank canvas and you're starting out in a yard and you don't know where to put your Japanese maple, early morning sun, late day shade is going to work for literally every single Japanese maple as its best condition. But there are tons of Japanese maples that are going to do excellent in sun. Mm-hmm. There are tons of Japanese maples that are going to do excellent in shade. There are tons of Japanese maples that are going to do excellent in containers. So there's a lot of different locations, and we can give you specific tips for each location. But it's really easy to do. And that early morning sun, late day shade, if you have that option, that's a no-brainer. That's the easiest thing to set up.
Absolutely. I love that we're starting there with that, because I think, everybody kind of is looking for that generic answer for, what type of lighting do I put my maple in? Mm-hmm. You could say that early morning sun, afternoon shade for just about every cultivar that there is in production would work great in that particular spot. So if you have that as an option, that should be your default. It really should. As a beginner, you just look out and you go, okay, in the morning, I've got some nice sun here. It's shaded in the afternoon by this large oak tree, whatever you're working with. That's your ideal spot. And that works great for so many different cultivars that you really couldn't go wrong planting in it in that location.
Yeah, and Japanese maples are really easy to grow. There's I'd mentioned zones 5 through 9. Zones are really based on how cold it gets. You've heard us say that a lot if you're a long-term listener of the MrMaple show, but they're really based on how cold it gets. One of the reasons we like putting zones 5 through 9 is because it's excellent for East Coast. It almost works perfect for East Coast. West Coast, there's a lot of, example breakers where somebody may even have a tree in full sun in zone 10, but they're not getting cold enough. Typically, zone 9, once you get into zone 9 in Florida, it's just too hot. The humidity's there. It's too hot past zone 9. Zone 9 works, but you're going to need late day shade and sometimes full shade in zone 9. Now, that's why it gets harder, because people say, like, what's always going to work in full sun? Well, again, maples work zones 5 through 9, and not all zones are created equally. So what works in zone 6 in full sun may not necessarily work in zone 9 in full sun, even though you can grow maples healthy and happy there.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I learned very quick in my beginning stages of growing Japanese maples was how necessary it is to do some research. And it's really not that difficult. And one of the great things I loved about MrMaple before I came to work here for MrMaple was their website had so much extensive information about each particular cultivar, what kind of sun they like to have. And it was very informative for me as a beginner to say, okay, man, I really like this tree and it's going to be able to handle full sun. And I'm excited about getting that planted out in my garden, and so depending on, and we're talking about location here. So when you're looking at your location out there, you can go to our website and say, man, I've got this spot. It's got a little bit more sun. So you can go there and search and find those more sun tolerant Japanese maples to work for that particular location. So that's the great thing about our website and our YouTube channel, is that we provide a lot of information for you to make a educated choice when you're making your decision on which Japanese maple to get.
Yeah, and again, for sun, this is an oversimplification, but it's great for beginners. The more pink, the more white, and the more yellow you have in your tree, generally those trees are going to need more late day protection. So that late day is really what we're talking about, is like 2 p.m. on sun and 3 p.m. on sun. Those can be the harshest. That's kind of when the sun's at its hottest sometimes, especially in our southern gardens. And if you can protect trees during that time, they can handle that early morning sun. That early morning sun often helps pick up the colors and keep your reds redder and your colors more vibrant. But if you can protect it from some of that hotter part of the day on a lot of your less solid colored plants. So if it's variegated with a lot of pink, a lot of white, or a lot of yellow, again, an oversimplification. They're rule breakers for sure. I mean, you can think of hot blonde and summer gold right now in the yellows, but in general, those plants are going to need more of that protection from the peak heat, and you're just going to have a healthier, better looking plant if you can provide that kind of condition.
Definitely, man. I'm glad we're talking about these tips today. I think it's going to be helpful for those beginner gardeners out there. So I guess we'll move on down the list here. The next thing I think we're going to jump into is watering. And so, I mean, that's kind of a crucial point too. I mean, all plants require a certain amount of water to live and thrive and to look great out in your garden. So as a beginner, you're always wondering, how is the best way to approach watering this plant? How much water can I give it? And let's get into that.
I mean, it seems too simple, but it's like, we often joke we're not Dr. Maple here, but we help everybody with all their maple issues all over the world. So people send us questions, whether they bought their trees here or not. Yeah. And we're often very eager to help answer those with our office staff. And you can diagnose 99% of problems with too much water or too little water.
Yeah,
so
right.
It's like, what's going wrong with my tree? Well, either has too much water or too little water. And so water becomes, it is life for plants. And so with Japanese maples, too much water can be the most damaging. So especially as a beginner, don't overwater your Japanese maples. They don't want to be in boggy or wet feet ever. And so if you have a condition that stay in boggy or wet feet, it might not be an ideal place for a Japanese maple. You could think about putting it in a container that has good drainage in that spot or raising the bed up. But they're not necessarily going to want to stay in a condition that stays continuously soggy. So that's something to always avoid with Japanese maples. What people say, well, what Japanese maple can I plant in this spot? It holds water. And we're like, none of them.
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's the honest answer. I mean, I could lie to you and sell you a tree. But the best answer is you want to pick a spot that's got excellent drainage. And, too little water can certainly be an issue in a drought condition, but it's normally not what you see. What you normally see is too much water. People love their plants too much. Yeah. They say, I don't know what's wrong with it. I put the water hose on it for about an hour and a half every day, and I don't know why it's looking so bad. It's getting lots of water. And it just simply, a smaller plant can't handle that much water. Right. It's staying saturated. So the number one tip with water is making sure it dries out well between waterings. That's kind of one of the beauties of Japan. They get these wet seasons, but then they dry out. And so completely saturating the root ball and then letting it dry out completely, that's perfect. And especially for a beginner gardener or a beginner with Japanese maples, don't be afraid to stick your hand down in the soil, stick your hand in there beside the roots. If the tree's damp, hold off completely. I mean, we do a whole podcast on watering because it's so important with Japanese maples. You have to make sure your container or wherever your plant is not holding water. I mean, we talk a lot about the saucer of death, but we see it a lot. So make sure that you have very good drainage, and then you want to water adequately. And that can be, there's a lot of variabilities there too. Like a lot of people want a specific answer.
Yeah.
But I mean, you in Oklahoma, you were watering a little bit more than you are in your North Carolina garden.
Absolutely. And I think, observation is the key when it comes to, watching how your watering is going, how your soil's drying out or staying too wet. And then one thing I learned right away when I first got into gardening was all of a sudden I was paying closer attention to the weather. Yeah. Right. Because, if you're talking about watering, but you've got like a really rainy week, you're not really needing to get out there and water. A lot of times nature will take care of some of that watering for you. And so you don't want to just be continuously watering, even though the weather patterns are giving you the efficient amount of water. I've seen a lot of people do that where they're just, no matter what the weather's doing, they're always watering. And it's like, no, you could take a little break from watering if you got some nice storms for a few days, And so I think it's important to pay attention to your weather. Cloudy conditions also really stops that moisture from dissipating from the soil, so it can stay wetter longer with a cloudy condition. Then when your sun comes out, then it really can draw that water out of the ground, which would require you to start watering more again. So I think there's a lot of observations that can be made as a beginner that are really not that difficult to do. You just have to take the time to say, it did rain the last few days. I don't think I need to water today. I think my plant's going to be good. Right.
Japanese maples are actually incredibly drought resistant. They're a plant that's very adaptive to many locations. That's why they work zones 5 through 9, which covers like most of the United States, right? Yeah. I mean, so much. And so they're very adaptive to different locations. With water, you want to be conscious that you're not planting plants around your Japanese maples that may require too much water. So, not all annuals, but some annuals are going to have to water them daily or they kind of look a little lackluster. So you might want to be careful putting things like that around the base of your Japanese maple. If you find yourself needing to water those daily to keep them from looking wilty, the Japanese maple is not going to be happy if it's getting that much, residual water from those other plants. So you got to be careful that what you're doing around it isn't causing you to overwater. Overwatering is by far the bigger issue. Underwatering can happen. You certainly see people go on vacation, have one in a container, and it dries out too quick because that root ball got bigger and the things are drying out a little quicker than you're used to. But most of your issues with water come from too much. And you'll be surprised. Sometimes a neighbor will change something in an area that wasn't too soggy in your landscape suddenly becomes pretty consistently wet more than you're used to. So be careful with that. And, raising Japanese maples up, we'll get into planting a little bit more in a minute, but planting them appropriately so that they're not ponding and holding that water, really a big deal.
That's one of the reasons why a lot of people ask about drip systems on Japanese maples. We really don't recommend it because the drip system doesn't take into consideration all of those variables, right? We're talking about weather, we're talking about location, all of those things. The drip system doesn't take into account for that. And so it would be great if you could I'll just put a drip system on it and I don't ever have to worry about watering it. Everything's good. But there's just too many variables for that to be the proper type of watering for your plant. You really have to give it some observation, check the soil, check the temperature outside, all of those things. There's too many variables there for a drip system to be watering it accurately.
Yeah. I mean, especially if it's set on a timer. I mean, it might be an adequate way to provide water in a drought situation, but with a timer that's just kicking on every single day.
Yeah.
Be careful with just sprinkler systems too. I mean, that's a great point. Sometimes overwatering occurs because we're overwatering our lawn.
Yeah.
You might be in a zone 8, Georgia or Florida, even maybe northern Florida, and you're watering your lawn consistently for a good green lawn. And you're just creating a situation where that newly planted Japanese maple, or even an older one, is just staying way too wet. And it's going to cause you more long-term damage. Japanese maples are extremely disease resistant. They're extremely pest resistant. Most of the pest and disease we can even occur with Japanese maples don't kill them. They can make them a little less desirable in a season, but by overwatering, we lead to a condition that leads to more of that. So you'll have more pest problems, more disease issues if they're staying constantly soggy, because that leads to fungal issues in the plant.
Absolutely. So I guess maybe we can jump on here to planting, give you some planting tips. I mean, this is a very common asked question we get all the time,
right?
About, how do I plant this? When do I plant it? Where do I plant it? All of those questions. I know a lot of beginners out there are unsure about that, and we'll try to answer some of those questions today.
I think this one can be kind of divisive sometimes. I mean, some people really get up in arms about this. There's certainly more ideal times and easier times to plant. We'll get into that. But I always think the best time to plant a Japanese maple is anytime the ground isn't frozen.
I agree with that, definitely.
So the old adage is, when's the best time to plant a Japanese maple? And I think people call it a Chinese proverb. People put that on everything now, right?
Yeah.
But it's I think they always say, it's either today or 20 years ago.
Right.
Because you want to enjoy your Japanese maples, and getting them planted is the easiest way to do that. It's the most carefree. If somebody's having an issue and I look at a plant and it's in a pot, I'm like, just plant it. Like you're not getting everything you need here, but if you get this thing in the ground in the right conditions, it's going to be happy. So planting your Japanese maple is typically the easiest way to care for it. And I think that's regardless of season. Now you do have to water more if you're planting it in July and August or peak heat, especially here in the South. You're going to hear a lot of people say, never plant in July. I plant all the time in July. That's when I have time as a gardener to plant. Right. And so I plant year round when the ground isn't frozen. Now fall is your easiest time to plant. Oftentimes, depending on the zone, fall is ideal. I will say in your zone 5 garden, I find that spring may be your best time because you're getting a little bit more root growth before winter.
Yep.
And you're getting that tree a little bit more set in. In most conditions, fall is ideal because the tree's not going to transpire. It's already about to drop leaf soon. And that's the easiest possible time you can plant. And I have amazing looking Japanese maples in my garden that we plant every year in August and every year in July in peak heat here in North Carolina. And so it's not one of those always has to be that way thing. Now you will require more watering if you're planting it in, midsummer. And we try to avoid when the ground's frozen. You're going to be disturbing your root ball. You're going to be making your plant a little bit more shocked if you're planting into a frozen ground. But oftentimes even planting that pot's going to give you a better success rate than keeping it in a container.
Definitely. Planting is one of those things where, like you said, the best time to plant is typically when you get it. I know a lot of you order from us here at Mr. Maple, and you get your 1 gallon and plant. And if it's just left there for you to tend to every single day, it's coming from a greenhouse that's on a watering system. And so all of a sudden now it's all based on your care to take care of that plant. And so it's going to dry out faster. It's going to, there's so much, sitting on a hot concrete, whatever. I always, when I first got mine, like when I first started ordering from you guys, I'd get my plants in, I'd go plant them, because I knew then I took away a lot of variables that were potential issues leading up to, the care for my plant. So I planted them right away most of the time. There was a few occasions, like you said, when we had frozen ground or something like that, or if it was just blazing summer, I was like, man, I might wait a month before I actually plant this out. But typically, man, when you get that plant, the best thing to do is to get it planted in the ground, because nature takes care of a lot of things for you, as far as just the condition of the soil, temperature of your pot, all of those things, a lot of those variables go away when you plant it in the ground.
Oh, for sure. And, I would go ahead and reiterate during this stage, we talk about this a lot here at our channel, but you don't want to bare root Japanese maples when they're in leaf. I think that's another rookie mistake that's easy to make. You'll see people who are self-proclaimed experts that do it. And could you get by with it a few times? Yes. Sometimes it can happen, but it's not a good idea. You're going to have more transpiration. You're going to have more plant shock. Japanese maples aren't the plant that you want to get, bare root them, stick them in a bucket of water for a week and then plant them. You see people doing that. They're used to the old school, bare root plants they got in the mail, and they stick it in a bucket of water like grandma, and we're getting it hydrated. Then we're going to plant it. Your Japanese maple will not be okay if you do that. And so we never want to have them in a super hydrated situation, but we also don't want to have them in a area where we're bare rooting them in leaf. You can bare root Japanese maples out of leaf. I still don't recommend it. That root ball is going to fill out on its own.
Yeah.
I think too much is made about teasing out Japanese maple root balls. They have microfibrous roots. They're a native plant in Japan, so I always joke that the Japanese aren't digging up all the trees and creating all the nibari in the fields. They'd be out there every day in the wilderness. I mean, you get into the wild and you look at how Japanese maples are growing natively, and they're really tucked into all these little nooks and crannies and on banks and in weird areas where the drainage is good. And that's really where you find a lot of the Japanese maples growing natively in the habitat in Japan. We went when we were on our Japanese TV show into the woods with Nakata-san, and we studied how Japanese maples were growing natively.
Right.
And, there's a lot of things you can take from that, especially our area seems very similar in some ways to Japan and the mountainous regions. And you just want to be conscious that you're not planting it too deep. That's the biggest deal when planting Japanese maples. They don't want to be buried too deep.
Yeah.
You never want to bury the graft. So Japanese maples are typically a grafted plant if you're new to this. Most of your named selections are grafted cultivars. And you want to plant your tree so that the collar of the plant is slightly raised and not too low. That's going to help you with the ponding. It's going to help you with the watering.
Definitely.
But if you're planting it too deep, you're going to suffocate those roots. They do like some oxygen. And younger plants are going to develop more of that really interesting buttress nibari and that kind of the root system, like, that root collar that everybody's wanting to expose. You're not going to see that a lot in younger plants. Like, you're not going to see that a lot in 1 gallons. But if you're planting it appropriately at the appropriate height, you're going to develop that easier without having to get in there and prune it in leaf. So don't bare root your plant and don't plant it too deep. Those are two of the easiest mistakes to make when growing Japanese maples. Bare rooting at the wrong time of the year, huge mistake, because you're going to create a situation where you're having to make up the distance that's happened. You've created a stress now, and now not only do you have a tree that's going in the ground new, you have to kind of nurture it back from the stress of being bare root.
Yeah. I mean, those are all great information for a beginner. I mean, there's just so many things that, you just have to take time to learn, and we're trying to get that information out there for you guys. I really enjoy getting in here and talking about plants because, and especially in this topic, kind of brings me back to when I first got into maples. And, it's crazy, man. Like, time goes by, and next thing I know, I'm sitting here in North Carolina doing a podcast with Matt. So it's pretty crazy. But yeah, I love this topic. So let's jump into like general care.
Yeah.
It kind of ties together with everything we've been talking about. There's a lot of different care techniques with Japanese maples. So, you've picked your spot, you've got it planted properly in the ground. You kind of got your watering situation figured out. Now you're just the general care for the plant.
I think the easiest thing to go wrong after this, and that's kind of where we want to really focus on the mistakes that are easy to make for newer gardeners, because we've made a lot of those mistakes. We've all been newer gardeners at one point, is not over fertilizing your Japanese maples. Yeah. So we did a whole fertilization podcast. You can go listen to that. We break down NPK and everything. I won't give you all that this time, but basically Japanese maples don't need a lot of fertilizer. They don't want to be over fertilized.
I mean, some of the first questions we get sometimes are people that get a brand new little 1 gallon Japanese maple. Oh, what kind of fertilizer do I use on this? And it's like, well, it's not really necessary. You know, like that's not really the first thing you need to think about when you're planting your Japanese maple is to fertilize it. Most of them do perfectly fine without fertilization. I mean, you can do that to encourage growth and things like that, but there's a lot to learn when it comes. If you're thinking about fertilizing, it's definitely something you want to do your research on before you start fertilizing that plant for sure.
Yeah, low nitrogen is typically your best friend with Japanese maples. You don't want to go really high on the nitrogen. We typically go a 15 or lower on that nitrogen number. And we can get more detailed into all that, but you don't want something super high. We cut off all of our granulated fertilization here after May, and you'll get better winterization. Again, we're in zone 6B here. We're in Western North Carolina. It's not uncommon for us to get -6, and we're going to have a better winterized Japanese maple if it's not something that's staying active during those winter months. So we don't want our tree pushing new growth going into a cold snap. We want it to shut down completely, and that's going to give us better fall color. It's going to give us better spring color and a healthier overall tree. Trees that are over pushed, they get that sap active in them in December. And then, maybe your area is getting 30 and then it's getting 18.
Yeah.
And that's splitting open. You're getting more insects and disease related issues because of over fertilizing your tree.
Definitely one of those topics that was important to cover. And then staying in with that caring. So a lot of care depends on what you've done with your plant. If you planted it out in the landscape, you're going to have a little bit different list of care tips that you can do for that. If you're growing it in a container, there's definitely more steps involved with that. And I'll get into some of just planting it out in your landscape. One of the things I always feel like is really important is that Japanese maples have a very shallow root system. A lot of their root system is on that surface of the ground. So I always think it's important to put a good layer of mulch around your plant if you plant it out in the landscape, because that's going to help you kind of monitor and just regulate the water and the surface temperature of the ground there where your plant is. Keep it from getting too hot or too cold even in the winter months. That mulch helps kind of insulate that ground surface. So I think it's really important as a care tip to think about mulching around your Japanese maples. Now, you don't want to put the mulch too close. You don't want the volcano of death. I see that, like, so many landscapers still do that to this day, and I can't understand why. Nobody's ever told them, don't do this, but we're telling you now, don't do the volcano of death. Keep the bark of the mulch away from the trunk of the tree because that just encourages insects and fungus and things like that to attack your plant. You don't want that, but you do want a nice layer of mulch on around your plant.
Yeah, if you're burying that graft union with mulch or even with soil, like we mentioned earlier, it's going to have to re-root above that. So you've slowed your tree down and you've opened it up to needing to put on roots in an area it doesn't want to. So you're going to slow that plant down a ton. It's going to underperform what you're looking for. A lot of times people will say, why isn't my tree growing? And well, you can kind of expose that root collar around there, and there's all these little white roots sticking out, right? Because that mulch was up against it. And, your air layer and your plant off at the base, you don't want to do that. You're wanting your tree to go out and grow and look healthy and happy. So you've created a situation in which it is forced to throw on roots in an area it shouldn't. And you can just get a healthier, faster growing plant if it's planted appropriately and you're not burying it. Now that mulch is so important though. You've cooled things down. You've made everything about growing this maple a little bit easier.
Yeah.
And it can really make a big difference toward the long-term success for a Japanese maple.
Now, growing it in a container, I will say right off the bat, I think is probably the most care intensive.
There's a few more steps.
Way to grow. It definitely is possible. There's Japanese maples that live their whole lives in containers. I mean, it's not too difficult to do, but it does require a lot more care involved because, you're basically the master of that plant. All of its nutrients, water, soil condition, all of those things, you are the one who control those variables. So
we've offered plenty of 20-year-old plants at a nursery, and people will look at it and I'll say, this is a 20-year-old plant. And they're like, and how old's this one? This is a 2-year-old plant. Well, how long can I keep it in a pot? Again, this is a 20-year-old plant. Right. So it's easy to do, but the drainage is really your biggest thing. And we have a whole podcast as well on containerized gardening. So you can get as specialized as you want with that.
Yeah.
One of the main tips I'll tell you, again, that zone 5 through 9 works, but that's in the ground. So you're going to have to be more cautious of sunlight in the container because your container may heat up. It may dry out much faster. Normally containers, even in zone 6 here where I'm at, I put them in shade, especially once it gets into the summer season. I don't have a lot of Japanese maples in containers in full sun. You're going to need to protect your Japanese maples in containers in zone 5 from your winters. Typically putting it in a pot takes it down one zone for that cold tolerance.
Definitely. And, thinking about our list here, when you're growing in containers, it kind of makes you have to go back and refocus on all of the things we've just talked about, which is location, where you're putting your plant in the pot. Like you said, you don't want that to be getting too hot. Your watering, you're going to have to monitor that even more than you would out in the landscape because a lot of times it's up underneath the porch or on the deck or something like that where It's not getting any natural water, so it's completely up to you as how often you water that plant. And then the planting is like, you select the soil that you plant it in. You need to get good drainage potting soil to put your maple in that pot. So, I mean, there's so many more variables, I think, in growing in containers, not to discourage you because it's something that's very easily done. It just takes more research and more care on your part as a beginner. You want to make sure you're covering these basic tips to be successful growing in a container.
Yeah, one more thing I'll throw out there for care that I always like to emphasize being in a cooler zone. Again, we're in zone 6B here in the mountains of Western North Carolina. You have to protect them sometimes from weather conditions. Now, if you've got a healthy, happy plant, you're going to not have to do a lot of steps. It's not like Japanese maples require a ton of steps. And I think most of the time when preparing for extreme changes in weather, people overlove their tree again. They make mistakes that causes more damage. Like I'll have people who will wrap their entire tree in burlap, or they'll put a plastic bag around the entire tree and they'll say, I'm leaving it there for December because we had a bad December last year.
Right.
And those things can cause more issues, but you do need to protect your young Japanese maples from frost or extreme weather changes. So if you're having an extreme weather change, we have a lot of extreme weather changes in Western North Carolina.
Definitely.
They're extremely durable for most things, but you will be required, especially to cover them if you're having some inclement weather after it's been very warm. So the more dangerous thing is a very warm, mild spring followed by extreme lows. So like even this year here in Western North Carolina, we started leafing out a little bit in February, which was unprecedented for us. It was very early. And then we had some kind of late freezes and late frost. And frosts are less damaging, but they do require you to prepare to cover those young plants. It can certainly mess up your season a good bit if you get frost on one. Oftentimes we'll recommend bed sheets or something permeable or frost cloth, something that's easy but not holding heat directly to the plant. You don't want to be putting plastic bags or something against your plant that's going to cause it to sweat out and have more issues. You don't want to force your tree into a false spring. And that's another thing. You bring your plants in containers in, you got to be careful not to give them a false spring.
Right.
And then get them back out there while it's still too cold.
Definitely. And, when it comes to covering and things like that, a lot of times, like you said, people think I'm just going to cover this and just leave it on. It's not a good idea. It's going to require you to do a little bit more work where you got to go out, cover it. You might have to go out, take it off, get ready for the next, cover it again. You don't want to just leave that covering on there because the plant's going to get too hot when the sun's out. It may get up to, 60, 70s during that day, but you might have a freeze that night, and so there's a lot of variables there to keep in mind when you're covering your plants in like a late frost situation or something like that. You don't want to just leave everything covered for 2 weeks. It's just not a good idea. The plant's going to suffer from that, probably even more than the frost damage itself. A lot of times that'll happen.
I see that more commonly being the issue than the original weather occurrences. Yeah. We put all this around our tree and left it there for February, and it's like, no, don't do that. That's preventing any water from getting to the base. That's they still require water in the winter months. If you're bringing them inside, you're gonna have to water at least 2 to 3 times a month, letting it dry out completely if you have it in a shed. So say you're protecting your containerized maples in Chicago and you're a zone 5 condition and you want to get those trees into an unheated garage, they're still going to require some water. So if you're putting a tarp or something over it to protect it, you've killed the tree for sure. It still needs some water during those winter months. We say this a lot, but water in well after those extreme changes in weather, that helps trees recover. But yeah, super simple things. That weather thing is something I always let people know because it's the next biggest mistake. You could do everything right, but not protect and still have some issues.
Right.
In general, if you do everything else right, the least you do, the better, right?
Absolutely.
Get things set up right, get these key steps in place, and then just coast. It's like sometimes I look at people's maple and they say, what am I doing wrong? And I say, well, the one you planted by your driveway and you forgot about it, that one looks great.
Right.
So, these other little care steps we're giving it, we're doing too much and we're overdoing it. And so be careful with the easy inclination is to really get fired up and like what you're doing. But sometimes we're our own worst enemies there too. So
absolutely
dialing it back a little bit, and measured responses are better.
So, we've covered some great tips here today, and we're going to get into some other things here, and I think this is probably like our favorite part coming up here. So we've got the location, we've got the watering covered, planting, caring for it. Now it's time to enjoy it, man.
Right.
Like there are so many amazing cultivars out there, for you to enjoy in your garden. That's really what got me excited. I remember the first time I brought a Acer Sirsaw and a moonrise home, planted it out in the garden. I literally would just sit out there for hours just watching it blow in the wind. It's like, man, this tree is so amazing. And so if you've done these other steps, then you can sit back and enjoy a healthy, beautiful Japanese maple every day in your garden.
I will say sometimes as beginners, people don't know how to enjoy Japanese maples.
Yeah.
So they're overstressed, they're over worried. They've done some step wrong in here. They're looking at one little brown leaf in
Right.
July, like you said, and they're like, I've killed it.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's going to, you're going to get to know that this is a common thing.
Right.
I think back to a phone call. I used to answer all the phone calls here we had, and a gentleman called me in tears. And, I'm not picking on him, but it was quite funny. The whole scenario, and he just didn't know what to enjoy about Japanese maples yet. I thought I was a prank call. I'm like, is this another nursery? You're such and such. This doesn't make sense. So this gentleman, he had bought a tree from me in Columbia, South Carolina in the spring, and it was a Hogyoku, which is famous for its fall color.
Yeah.
And so this guy, being a beginner, didn't really know how to enjoy his Japanese maple. He was in tears, and he said, Matt, I don't know what's wrong with my tree. I bought this from you, and it was green. And now the thing's neon orange.
Oh, man.
And I mean, he was in tears. He was like, this just does not look right.
There's something wrong with my tree.
Something is terrible wrong with this plant. And I would say sometimes further south, people don't realize that maples are deciduous. So they'll get very nervous when trees go deciduous, and not picking on anybody, but some people don't understand deciduous plants, especially as you get into regions where they're not as familiar with plants that drop leaf like we are here in Western North Carolina. So Japanese maples are going to go through those amazing changes. And that's really something we learn to enjoy about every season. And with this gentleman, I continued, like it's gonna do that right before it drops a leaf. And so I'm waiting for like the real big tears. It's gonna drop a leaf. And by the end of the conversation, he was like, this is pretty cool. I think maybe this fall color is something I could learn to look forward to every season on this. So learning how to enjoy your Japanese maples is part of it. Like you have to kind of learn what you appreciate. They teach you patience. You wait on them to leaf out in the spring.
Definitely.
It's that gardener, conifers don't give you too much patience. You got 24/7 greenery going on with most of the evergreens. And with Japanese maples, you have to kind of learn to enjoy all those different seasons.
Absolutely.
There's a wait for spring. There's a joyfulness for spring. There is every season matters with Japanese maples because you enjoy that springtime, but then it changes.
Absolutely.
And then you enjoy those new growth flushes, but then that changes. And then you get into that fall season and you start to really focus on each little aspect of it. And so enjoying the trees for what they do and, just kind of understanding how they work comes with time as you grow them. You start to get that appreciation for each nuance.
Absolutely. There are so many different cultivars too that do so many different things. That's the exciting part about it as a beginner, because you've just scratched the surface. Say you ordered your first Japanese maple. I mean, you just scratched the surface. And like I said, learn to enjoy all the characteristics of the plant. Each plant has so many different variables to it, as far as what its spring color is, what its fall color is, how it performs in the summer. Just some of them just have this majestic form in the landscape. It's just, there's so many different things to enjoy about it. And sometimes and all of our worry about the plant and the care and all of those things, if you do those things right first, then you can just sit back and enjoy that plant. Right.
And then you really start to get into the world of nuances and all the variabilities. And that's when people really become collectors, because there's this whole nother world of Japanese maples. I would say most people get into Japanese maple either from Bloodgood, like they bought a Bloodgood somewhere. They might have saw it on sale at a hardware store or something for very little. Or they found a seedling from a Japanese maple and they said, Grandma gave me this seedling. And that's how typically people get into it. And then they start to realize, like, this is pretty cool. This keeps changing. They may have got into it through a red upright or a lace leaf. That's another classic way to kind of get into maples. But then they start to see those nuances and start to enjoy all those differences. And then your mind gets opened up to the world of Japanese maples. That's when you become a collector. That second maple, there's no turning back after that second maple. Right. The first maple you might not have paid attention to, but there's no turning back after the second one.
That's right, man. So I guess we could jump into a few recommendations of things that I think would be great for beginners. If you're just kind of sitting there scratching, you said, okay, well, where do I start? Like what maple do I get for my garden? I think we've got some solid choices here to kind of recommend to you guys. Let's get into some of those.
So again, a lot of people get into Bloodgood. If you're looking for a heat tolerant red upright, Fire Glow and Emperor One are going to be great choices as well. I mean, those are very basic upright reds. If I have somebody ordering a blood good in Texas, I'm like, hey, maybe consider Emperor One.
Right.
It leafs out late. It's easy to grow. It's going to beat blood good to 15 feet, but tend to slow down there a good bit. And Emperor One it's pretty much bulletproof. It's an easy one to be growing for most people who are looking for a red upright.
Yeah, it gives you that classic Japanese maple look that you kind of have seen in all the pictures and all the landscapes around. You're like, man, what is that red tree over there? Typically, it's going to be, an Emperor One or Bloodgood type, either the cultivar or seedling forms of that. In most landscapes that you see around, it's an impressive tree, absolutely stunning red colors in the spring, and then giving you scarlet reds in the fall. So, I mean, I love just. Even though it's just a basic classic, right. it has its place in every garden. It definitely has its place.
Now, one thing I always like to bring up for beginners, and one of the most, I would say, things you kind of learn about early on when you're getting into Japanese maples, is that from seed, they don't have a cultivar name. So if you have a blood good and it's a seedling, you really don't have a blood good. You have a seedling from blood good, totally different thing. Some Japanese maples from seed will look like the parent plant, but there's a lot of variability. So you want to have a grafted form to know you have a specific name variety. If it's from seed, then you don't have a cultivar named Japanese maple.
And we get emails about this all the time. Somebody goes across to their neighbor's yard, they take a picture and they say, what is this? I want a tree like this. Well, it could be that's a variable of some sort, a seedling of any kind. But we can say, well, here's some trees that would look like that.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
we
that's
can't get
the
you
best
an exact clone of a seedling.
Right. But that's the best way to approach that is if you have a tree and you're like, man, I want one like that. We can get something that's going to give you at least a close appearance to what you're looking for. Typically in cultivation, we have just about any kind of variety that you may see out in the landscape. It may be not that exact plant. It may be a actual cultivated clone of that plant or something similar to it. But we can definitely find something that would fit that description that you have.
Now, I would say most people, what they think of, like when I go to the dentist and they say, oh, you grow Japanese maples. Well, first off, they ask me if I have maple syrup. So
right. Yeah. Almost
I don't. I go to the 10-year reunion. Oh, Mr. Maple, do you have maple syrup? No, I don't. But then what people think of, they're like, you grow those bonsai bushy ones that are kind of like this. And, they start making the hand motions like, yes, I do. And so people think of lace leaves as an entryway into Japanese maples. Definitely. So a lot of times beginners and new people to Japanese maples, you're going to start out with something like a Crimson Queen or a Tamukiyama. Now, Tamukiyama is going to outperform Crimson Queen in sun, but Crimson Queen's a great tree for shade. They're both going to have more of that umbrella-like shape, and that's often what people associate mentally with Japanese maples. That's the first thing that comes to mind for most people.
I love the weeping, mounding lace leaf forms. Not only do their leaf and texture just give you this like elegance to the garden, but their form. I love seeing that form that they create with these arching and bending and twisting branches to it. It really gives you something unique. I mean, when you think of a tree, you're typically thinking of a large, upright, big trunk, branching at the top, big, broad canopy. But a Japanese maple lace leaf tree is going to give you this beautiful mounding and weeping character in the garden. And I, you plant these, and I've never seen two Tamukiyamas that look the same.
Right.
Like they always create these unique forms in your landscape, and it just provides an amazing appearance there. I love the lace leaf varieties.
Something else we like to stress here at Mr. Maple, and I think it's important to learn it if you are a beginner, is people will say, what's the max size to this one? So they'll say, what's the max size Tamukiyama can ever get? And we always like to look at it as like these variables. What we always try to do is give people a time with a size. So that way you can better understand the growth rate. I've seen Japanese maples that were over 400 years old.
Yeah.
And every single time the tree leaves out, it grows. Yeah. So every single season, it's going to put on some form of new growth. If it's healthy and happy and it's not shrinking because of some of these other issues we talked about earlier, it's going to grow.
Yeah.
And Japanese maples should live to be over 100 years old. So the life expectancy of Japanese maples is quite long. So you will find some bigger plants. Tim and I always joke that because of that, the older cultivars are all listed as real big.
Yeah.
And the newer cultivars are all listed as real small.
Yeah.
And it's because no one has a 40-year-old nebula, but that doesn't mean it's smaller than something that's been around for 40 years. It just means there's no examples of that at that size. So what we look at is growth rate, and we try to give you a 10-year expectancy. So we'll say like in 10 years under normal conditions, this is kind of what you should expect. But I think maturity is kind of a disingenuous term sometimes. Like it can be a catch-all. And a lot of times on garden labels, they just make stuff up. So they're like, this could reach 25 by 25 feet at maturity.
Right.
It's like, yeah, there might have been one in Japan that size, but like let's pump the brakes on that a little bit. So we try to give you the best possible answer. Now, there's so much variability. So the next question is, how big do Japanese maples get?
Yeah.
And the truth is, we have trees that are 3 feet in 10 years. We have trees that are 20 feet in 10 years. So there's a ton of variability as you get into these different nuances. I know you listed one up here that's a very fast grower. Do you have a suggestion for one that tends to be, if somebody is new to Japanese maples and they want something that's kind of get out there a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. Seriu is one of my favorites. This is one I grew in my garden in Oklahoma, and we had a very high heat area there. I grew that in full sun, and it was just such a vigorous grower out there in the landscape. And what's interesting about this, and as a beginner, you kind of start to learn all the nuances about these different cultivars, is this is a very unique plant because it gives you that lace leaf that we were talking about with the mounding, but it's an upright. So it gives you that unique texture with a smaller lace leaf style leaf on it, but it gives you a nice upright, broad canopy. And it just has such a great feel out there, real feathery, light feel out in the garden. Just a beautiful plant.
I like that you put it on this list because I think it's a perfect tree for beginners in so many ways. It's bulletproof, it can handle the sun, up to zone 8 typically in full sun.
Yeah.
It's vigorous, so it breaks a lot of the rules people think about. Well, Japanese maples are small.
Right.
I need something that gets big in my garden. I need something I can get in the shade of. I want a shade tree. Mm-hmm. You'll be surprised. It's not uncommon for Seriu to put on over 1.5 foot of growth a year. So it does tend to be a plant that you can garden around. Yeah. Like your other Japanese maples can be shaded out by your Seriu. If you're new to Japanese maples, it can provide shade for your other plants. But it's bulletproof. I mean, it's got great red fall color. It's got great spring interest. So you've got ever-changing beauty there as well. But it's pretty much an easy plant. I think more people should look at that as their second or third tree because one, you're gonna get some shade for the future collection going on there.
Absolutely.
But it's also just it's bulletproof. It's so simple of a plant to grow.
You're right. I mean, so many people, we hear this all the time. They're like, well, I want something. I'm 60 years old. I want something I can enjoy. But the Seriu is a great plant for that because it really does get out there quick and provides you a really fast grower. You typically, when you're thinking about Japanese maples, you think, man, these are going to take forever to get that big. And, as a beginner too, I want to encourage you to not be afraid to get 1 gallon plants. I used to, when I first got started, I was like, well, I'd have to wait so long, for this plant to really to have a presence out in the garden. And then like 3 years later, I was like, well, if I would have just bought that 1 gallon plant, it would be this nice, beautiful, like 3 to 4 year old plant out there in the landscape. So I was like, I encourage you to not be afraid to get smaller 1 gallon plants. And to me too, I think planting them when they're young like that really gets the root system established better also in your condition. They get acclimated faster to your climate and your soil type. They get a better root system going on while they're young. And then by the time they hit those growth spurts, man, they're ready to just take off.
Right. It's funny. Japanese maples, we grew up doing a lot of garden shows. And so they do kind of make people face a little bit of mortality.
Yeah, right.
People will say like, we don't like the term maturity. So then they're like, well, how big is it going to be in 15 years? And they say, I'll never see that in 15 years. And my point to them is you can enjoy this plant at every size.
Absolutely.
So I have 1 gallons that I go out and check on every single second I get a chance because they're so interesting. And there's something to be said for kind of having that experience of watching it grow as well. It's a fun thing to plant a Japanese maple when a kid's young and then take pictures of the kid, and the tree. And then you're looking at a 15-year-old kid and the 15-year-old tree is pretty big. Right. And so it's kind of a fun experience to kind of watch people grow with trees. But don't be afraid to enjoy trees at all sizes. If you're going to get into Japanese maples, you'll be missing out on so much if you don't enjoy them at their young age. A lot of times we rush to think about having like this pinnacle specimen. Yeah. And I would tell you that honestly, I've been to some 60-plus-year-old gardens. Right. And a lot of times they're not as exciting as a 10-year garden. Right. A 10-year-old Japanese maple garden has more beauty sometimes than a 60, 80, 100-year-old collection.
And it's just because you can still get up on the plant and really see all of its amazing characteristics. A lot of times when they get larger, 20, 25 foot tall, it's hard to really get to appreciate every unique characteristic about it, although they're absolutely beautiful at that size. But, you kind of lose some of those characteristics that you would be able to see on a young plant. You could pull that branch down and just admire the beautiful spring colors on that leaf. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
There's a lot of things to enjoy at smaller sizes as well. So one of my all-time favorites, and this is a great Japanese maple for beginners, and it's on all of our lists, so no shocker here, Makawa Yetsubusa.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons I recommend this one for beginners, it's got a lot of what people are looking for. So people will come to us and they'll say, I want a bonsai tree.
Yeah.
You got them bonsai trees? And so I'm like, well, let me tell you something. Any tree can be turned into a bonsai.
That's right.
So like it really bonsai is the technique of what you're doing. But Makawa Yetsubusa has a lot of those bonsai-like qualities. So even if you're a beginner to growing plants, you can put a Makawa Yetsubusa in a container and you've got a really cool plant. Like people are going to ask you, did you bonsai this? Did you prune this to look like this? Because naturally it's a very dense, thick canopy that's really shingled layering. And it's a durable plant being that it's a green, goes to a great bold orange in the fall, has a lot of structural interest even out of leaf. It's tough as nails in sun. So if it was a beginner plant, I mean, I'd point a lot of people toward Makawa Yetsubusa.
Man, I absolutely agree with that. And then, if you have other friends around and they're in that beginning stage and you bring home a Makawa and plant it out, they're going to be like, what in the world is this?
I did not know you were a bonsai master.
I mean, you're really going to impress all of your friends with Makawa. I mean, they just really do have a striking presence in the garden. Their structure and leaf form, all of that just really, I mean, it makes it stand out amongst any other plants, I mean, in your landscape. They just create unique forms. I've seen so many different ones of this, big sizes, smaller size, all of them very unique and very special. I love the growth habit that has, that tight layered shingling of the leaves, great fall color on that plant too. I mean, you can't go wrong with Makawa.
It's hard to mess it up. Yeah. It's going to give you something that's going to give you expert level interest at beginner level work, right? There's nothing you have to do. It just looks great already. It's going to give you this aesthetic of like you prune your garden and you're all into these different, but you don't have to do anything with this one. It looks cool right out the gate and just a really bulletproof plant too. So it's one I recommend for higher heat zones, for colder zones, consistent on the fall color. And it's one that tends to be, I would say, early on in people's collecting of Japanese maples.
Man, we've got a killer list going on here. We hope you guys have been enjoying just these tips and care information, cultivar recommendations for that beginner gardener. This is what it's all about. We're trying to create excitement out there for you guys about getting into gardening and planting Japanese maples. There's so much out there to explore and discover. I still get excited. I mean, I was thinking the other day, I made an official list of what cultivars I had in my garden. Nice. And then I was thinking about what I had in Oklahoma. And I'm like I'm 500 plus cultivars I've collected in my lifetime so far. And I'm still excited about it. You know what I mean? Like there's still, I go out in the greenhouses and I'm like, whoa, check this out. I gotta get one of these. So, if you're just getting going with it, I'm telling you, man, it's an exciting thing. You're going to love every moment of it. And it's such a long-term investment into your lifestyle, your landscape. It brings just so much joy for a long time. It's not just an instant gratification. It's something that gives you a lifelong enjoyment for sure.
Oh, I'm 41. And like many people know, if they've even watched our podcast on the story of MrMaple, I grew up doing this with Dad.
Yeah.
And, we had several hundred cultivars in the 90s. Right. And so I've looked at a lot of differences. I get fired up every day at something new. I'm like, wow, this is crazy. I've never seen this. Have you seen it do this? Let's go check this out. We're grabbing somebody and let's go look at this in this greenhouse. This is wild. And so this next tree is kind of one of those next level things. I'd say it's on that beginner scale, but once you get into the Ghost series, you get into something like Purple Ghost, you start to find variegated Japanese maples. Yeah. You start to find reticulated Japanese maples. That's when there's really no turning back, right? That's when we got them. And then they're hooked. Now you're signed up for a 10 of 10. You're a plant collector. You're a maple fanatic, and you're gonna have a whole yard full of Japanese maples. Because I think Purple Ghost really is one of those turning points too, where you see that level of flashiness that Japanese maples can have.
Yeah.
You're starting to be exposed to the variegated types. So there's all these different nuances there of styles of variegation, reticulation. And it really, I think a lot of people, the first time they see Purple Ghost, they're like, it's an emotional reaction.
Yeah, absolutely.
We did a video recently with the original podcast, or original Purple Ghost, there at Buckholtz Nursery. And it was just such a cool thing to see. It was planted there in 92. And it was like, you know how many people this has turned on to Japanese maples?
Right.
Like this was really a seminal point in plant collecting, because there were a lot of cool plants before that. But you think about Purple Ghost, and it really probably is a big turning point for popularity of maples in America. One, people could say it. So it was easy for a beginner to get into, oh, look, give me that Purple Ghost. But people knew what they were looking at immediately when they heard it. And it was unique and distinctive. And I think once you get into that kind of level, you're starting to look at some of the different variegated types. You're getting to a little bit higher level of sophistication than you first got into maples. But I think that's when you're definitely hooked.
Definitely, man. You can go down the rabbit hole, and that rabbit hole is beautiful, man. Like, it really does take you into a whole next level world of plants. You get into variegation, reticulation. I mean, some of this stuff, like when I first got started, I had no idea that existed. Like, there's leaves on a tree that look like this, like Kumoy Nishiki, for example, or Purple Ghost, Amber Ghost, some of those, like, I had no idea that there were trees out there that had foliage that looked that amazing. I mean, it will blow your mind when you get into, getting deeper and deeper into collecting Japanese maples.
So full disclosure, blue Japanese maples don't exist. You beginners, don't get duped into buying any seeds from China. You're not going to get Jack and the Beanstalk. There's no magic happening. I've had people grow them, and I always look at them like, I better check, because, what if he does get a blue one? So I'm like, hey, show me what you get.
If you do get one, make sure to give us a call.
But most of the time what you get is something that looks like squash. Right. So people get some kind of seed that's been, microwaved so it never shows up or something. And it's a scam. So they'll literally take trees, pictures from our website, pictures from the Pacific Rim Bonsai Collection. There's a very famous trident maple at the Pacific Rim Bonsai Collection, and I see more pictures of that one turned neon blue than anything else. I'm like, I know that specific tree, and it's not blue. But Purple Ghost is real. So I always like to let people new to Japanese maples know there might not be those light blue shades that you're looking at, but there's some unreal colors that you can find that aren't Photoshopped, that are out of this world. I mean, I think realizing what is a possibility is a thing when you're new to Japanese maples. You see Purple Ghost, and you're like, that can't be real.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, just kind of to plug our channel again, one of the cool ways is you can go back and really just kind of get a rapid fire of a lot of different cultivars. Go back and watch our 10 at 10 videos. We do 10 new trees every week. So we're putting out a new video every single week. And we always pick 10 of those plants, and we highlight them and kind of go and talk about their characteristics, the history behind the plant, where you can grow them, best location, how to care for them, those type of things. Those 10 at 10 videos can really start taking you down that rabbit hole of like, wow, I did not have any idea that these plants existed, because we do a lot of unique stuff, and we're constantly trying to put out new plants. So as a beginner, I mean, that's an exciting place to go to. And also make sure you sign up for that email, because we will have an email that'll come out each week, and we'll give you notifications of all of these amazing Japanese maples that we're releasing each week. I mean, it's exciting to think about getting into it. Like I said, I keep reminiscing here as I'm talking about when I first got into Japanese maples, and it gets me excited. People
often ask, what are good books for Japanese maples? And there are a lot of new cultivars. So a lot of newest things you won't even find in some of the literature. There is Japanese Maples by Timber Press by J.D. Vertrees. He did the first and second editions there. Excellent books. I've got a copy of J.D. Vertrees' first edition right here in front of me signed. Excellent book as an entryway point. My late and good friend Peter Gregory did a third and fourth edition, as well as a pocket guide. And so those were updated a little bit further. Those were really finished before I was even on the scene here, to be honest with you. And there's so many new cultivars out there since. Most of those predate 08, 07 for when that book was, kind of in its printing stages. And so there's a lot of new things out there. Definitely be checking out our channel. We actually have more videos on cultivar breakdowns on our YouTube channel than are in books on Japanese maple. So you can go watch a video, either with a 1 gallon or with a specimen. Really get to see what these look like. Brian talks about doing your research. We try to do it for you sometimes and make it a little bit easier. So our care sheet comes with guided instructions, and you'll see us explaining it in person on there. So I think an easy way to learn a lot. One, go to our cultivar descriptions. If you're new to Japanese maples, you can go see what a nice size RM looks like. We'll take you to a specimen.
Right.
You want to learn about how to grow Japanese maples, go to our Friday videos. We've got how-to videos on Fridays. We've got a full playlist, and just go back through that and pick and choose where you want to learn, because there's several hundred videos in each playlist often.
Yeah.
Some of our ideas are newer, so there might not be several hundred like top fives, but we've got a breakdown of different things. And I would say the most valuable for those new gardeners are that how-to and that cultivar highlight. That's really what we based our channel on starting out on. We've done a whole lot of different shows now, so there's all kinds of garden walkthroughs and podcasts and fun things we do. But if you want to get to the crux of it and learn a lot quickly, go check out those cultivar highlights. Go check out our how-tos. We'll give you, the most honest, fair, and free advice we can on how to grow Japanese maples.
Absolutely, man. And that's what this podcast is all about today too. I mean, we really enjoy getting in here talking about plants and just trying to get everybody excited about gardening. I mean, I love gardening. I think it brings such a unique element to life that a lot of people are missing. And so if you can get into it and learn about it and do your research and get in there and try to be successful at it, I think you're going to, the rewards you get from it are huge, man.
Hey, if you're new to Japanese maples and you just found this podcast, first off, sorry, because you're hooked now. So, get ready for your whole lifestyle to change to be focused more on Japanese maples because that rabbit hole's already been opened and there's no coming back out of it. But if that's already happened, definitely sign up for Mr. Maple's emails. We'll be glad to send you lots of maple-related information. Find us on your favorite podcast platform, give us 5 stars, and go sub to the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube. It's a great resource. Again, it's all free. We provide 7 days a week gardening content here. Most of our content is Japanese maple related. We talk about some conifers, azaleas, lots of other cool plants too. We don't just do Japanese maples here at Mr. Maple, but that's definitely our calling card and what we're known for. And we're always striving to kind of show you what we get fired up about here and share that passion of growing Japanese maples with you.
Absolutely, man. We appreciate you guys tuning in. So take care.
God bless.
Have a great day.